When I'm walking down the street.
I do want to say to Doni and many of you in this room that over a very long career in this city, all of you have helped me and my colleagues tell the truth and to try to tell.
I may not look like you and you me, but
my head up.
I'm from South Carolina, so I just
What does this event mean to you, Miss Peggy Morris?
Oh, my heart.
Happy 20th anniversary.
My heart is about loving up on my sisters. Do you know what it feels like to have your sisters in the room? Done.
And dare to be different and unique. I'm gonna be the best me I can be by letting His glory shine through. I am beautiful, I am blessed, but not just what you see in the flesh. I'm free from people, free from myself.
The doctor lived next door to the janitor, to the reverend, and the lawyer. We were together. Now we get so high and mighty that you create stress for your society because you don't like poor black folks either. That's a health problem. Get yourself together so I can stop being taking care of geriatric people and get back to pediatrics. I thank you, Doni, for all you've done. Let's keep doing it all the more.
Letting His glory shine through. Dare to be you, dare to be me, dare to be different and unique. I'm gonna be the best me I can be by letting His glory shine through. And I dare you, I dare you, I dare you to be you.
First name's Doni, last name's Glover. In it to win it for the long haul, baby. We have our guest with us today, Mr. Travis Mitchell, Maryland Public Television. Good morning, sir. Travis, public.
Good.
All is well?
All is well. Doni, I think I may be having a slight internet challenge that just came in. Just want to alert you that in case we have some technical difficulties and I've got to log back in.
No, okay. Well, we sound good right now.
Good, good, good.
So HBCU week is upon us. What is HBCU week for those who don't know?
Well, HBCU week started, first and foremost, Doni, thank you for having me today. I appreciate being on your show. Love what you do. Mr. Baltimore himself is in the house, so I get a chance to make that real connection and talk about real things. So it's from that place that I'll share that 4 years ago when I came to Maryland Public Television, being a graduate of Morgan State, having grown up on the campus of Shaw University, my story is simply this: no Shaw, no Morgan, no me. And when I came to Maryland Public Television, I thought that we really needed to embrace our HBCUs and also the city of Baltimore, which had not been something that had been done in the 50-year history of Maryland Public Television to the degree, the depth, and the breadth of what was needed. And so 4 years ago, we established 4 seasons ago, HBCU Week as a week-long of primetime programming dedicated to showcasing films that tell the undertold story of the courage, the history, and the contemporary relevance of our nation's HBCUs. One of the anchor films that we started with was a Emmy award-winning film that I happened to co-executive produce on the history of the oldest HBCU in the South, Shaw University, the home of the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And there's a line in that film that says, no SNCC, no Civil Rights Act, no Voting Rights Act, no Obama. And so when you look at what HBCUs have meant historically as the catalyst for really contributing and developing Black intelligentsia and giving birth to the Black middle class, had it not been for HBCUs, where would we be? And so that reality is not just steeped in history. It also, when you take a look at the proportional of graduates that come from HBCUs that make up only 3% of the nation's four-year institutions, but graduate 19% or roughly thereabout of the nation's four-year graduates. And I know you're aware, with only 15 HBCU engineering schools, they graduate the lion's share of Black engineers in the country, STEM professionals, doctors, lawyers, so forth and so on. So no HBCUs, no vibrant Black community. And that's why HBCU Week was born.
You know, I saw a map just this week, blew my mind, of where the HBCUs are. And the person showing me this map asked me, did you notice anything? They were mostly red states.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, where are you going with this? And I can't remember who said it, but they said, well, we had to have HBCUs in these states, and it was what, Pennsylvania, down to Florida, over to Texas, because they would not educate us. And it just made me think, well, geez, the other half of the map, we could get an education. There was no need, generally speaking, for an HBCU. I don't know. It brought together, I mean, I'm almost 60 years old, and it just really brought home the significance and purpose of the HBCU.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, because in our documentary in Shaw Rising, I want to make a point that most people don't realize, and we need to further unpack this. So in the North, there were efforts by Northern philanthropists, for instance, to establish HBCU, for instance, in New Haven, Connecticut, in the backyard of Yale. The folks at Yale rallied against it and didn't want to have an HBCU in their community, and it was a very aggressive attack against establishing HBCUs. And I although I can't necessarily unpack the trend lines or show similar activities yet, because I'm doing research, there was a little bit of a hostile reaction from white academia in the North against the establishment of HBCU. So some of the same folks who fought against and fought for the abolition of slavery and fought against slavery, some of those same folks, principally who were on the right side of history, were on the wrong side of history as it related to establishing schools for the training and the uplift of the newly freed slave to be able to take his and her place in leadership realms in society. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned that map, because I think what also begs for further exploration is how in the Confederate States was there a proliferation of HBCUs without them being decimated and closed? And this is where I think it requires us to re-examine, for instance, Booker T. Washington. I really feel that we do not understand en masse exactly what he stood for and what he was doing. So if you take all of this kind of surface level debate between Du Bois and Washington, let's get to the business strategy of Washington. And I think it's a microcosm of why HBCUs were able to succeed. I'm gonna offer you something I heard when I gave a speech at Talladega in Alabama, for instance. So when we go back to the founding of HBCUs, now I'm talking about in the South, you have people of goodwill, Northern philanthropists, white investment in education. You had newly freed slaves who had established trades and businesses. There was a church level fervor around giving to HBCUs. Many of them were rooted in the church. So there was this coalition of the willing in terms of investing in and standing up these schools. We must understand that. They were truly the first interracial places, if you will, in America, because you had white professors, because there were no trained black, or not many trained black professors at that particular time. So you had white administrators, but then you had a mixture of this diversity on these campuses, particularly in the Deep South. So many of the white professors and administrators faced hostile reactions in the local community until the value proposition of the local HBCU could be proven. That's why I kind of come back to Washington for a moment. So when Washington left from Hampton to go to Tuskegee, he was summoned by two men. One was a former slave who had become a major craftsman in the area, and the other one was a former slave owner. They recruited Washington to come and establish Tuskegee. Now, when Washington gets to Tuskegee, he realizes the environment he's in. And let's understand the brilliance of this 28-year-old young man who comes to Tuskegee. He says he got there and he felt like he was like the children of Israel making bricks without straw. The necessary ingredients and infrastructure was not there. So he had to build an ecosystem for Tuskegee's success. Now, what he does is, first of all, he recruits students to the campus, and every student then had to be a part in building the campus. So he brought students with level of trades and understanding what they grew up learning on the plantations. He brought them to Tuskegee to help him build that school. And that's one thing that people need to really understand when they take an attack at Tuskegee for vocational education. I'm gonna come back to that misnomer for a moment. The second thing he did, Doni, is he said, okay, now I need to make sure this school has utility in the local area. So what they ended up doing is they built a kiln. They built a kiln to make bricks. And so now people in the local community, if there's construction, you come to Tuskegee to get your bricks. The third thing he did is he said, all right, I'm going to they actually created a mattress manufacturing center on the campus of Tuskegee. So anybody that wanted mattresses had to get them from Tuskegee. And then the final stroke of brilliance, and I'm gonna come back to another masterful stroke, was that he recruited Carver, George Washington Carver from Iowa State, the first African Americans, or one of the first to get a PhD in the biological sciences. He was in Iowa. He recruits him from Iowa State to come to Tuskegee. Carver gets there, and the first beginnings of what we now know as agricultural extension or cooperative extension. He begins to go out into the rural areas and teach the farmers how to take care of their soil, because they were stripping the soil of nutrients. They weren't rotating the crops, and it was devastating the Southern economy. So when Tuskegee is at the epicenter of this movement to reform Southern agriculture, now it builds for Washington. He makes allies of enemies. And so they would not allow fringe elements in the racist Klan movement to destroy Tuskegee, because if you burn down Tuskegee, you destroy the local economy. It's not that they were morally for HBCUs, they were economically for them, because the economy of their local economy was tied to the research and the industry that was coming off of these campuses. So we also have to remember that the initial HBCUs didn't just educate freed slaves, they also educated poor whites. And so you had this need to train a new workforce. And so Washington, I think, has been miscast in history. When you are trying to build an institution or build a business, it's much different when you're responsible for shepherding resources and protecting people and putting yourself in a position to provide uplift to a community. It's much different than being able to be untethered as an advocate. An advocate is free. Du Bois was free to express his thought concepts unhindered by any additional responsibilities. Washington had to meet payroll. Washington had to build buildings. Washington had to get resources to distribute for the funding of all HBCUs. And not only did Washington build Tuskegee, which had by the time he was done, a $30 million endowment, unheard of at that time. You have Ford coming to Tuskegee, Carnegie coming to Tuskegee. What he was doing is publicly, if you revisit the Atlanta Compromise speech, which people need to understand that the Klan was off to the right side of the stage when he was giving that speech. And had he said something that they found inflammatory, they were going to hang him. So people need to understand that the Atlanta Compromise speech is a parable. He's talking in parables. He's talking about being separate as the fingers on the hand, but yet united. The united piece he's talking about is in industry. And he's talking about there is no political power without economic power. Revolutionary stuff that people didn't understand. We know today that economics is what drives politics. In fact, the definition of politics is the battle for scarce resources. So kind of coming back and ending it with this, why did HBCUs proliferate in the South? There's something else that we need to understand about the Tuskegee model. And that is when America was moving from an agricultural society to an industrial age, from the agricultural age to the industrial age, Washington had developed a curriculum at Tuskegee whereby he wanted students to learn. It's a misnomer that Tuskegee was a trade school. He wanted students to gain the necessary experiences and trades. So when they left Tuskegee to go back to these plantations in the local areas, they could set up shop as craftsmen. But at the same time, they used critical thinking, design thinking as the curriculum. So when you were identifying problems and proposing solutions in your trades, it also stimulated your design thinking. So he developed a liberal arts curriculum based off of the industry. Now, why that's important is because at the same time, America was transitioning from agriculture to industrial economy. The National Board of Education dispatched all of their top leaders to Tuskegee to model the 20th century high school curriculum that still exists today off of the curriculum at Tuskegee. And so Washington had a profound impact on our community. And so the HBCU proliferation was because in many of the local markets, HBCUs had great utility because they were training craftsmen. They were not just training Black people, they were training poor whites as well. You needed a labor force to make the transition from agriculture to industry. And even in agriculture, with the onset of new equipment and new tools for agriculture, you needed people who knew how to utilize those tools. So HBCUs proliferated, ironically, in the Deep South out of economic need. And it was in Talladega, I gave a speech and I was told that when Talladega was founded, in its early founding, that the Klan was marching to come to Talladega to burn the campus down. It was white locals who were benefiting from Talladega, who took up arms and faced down the Klan and turned them around. And that's what kept Talladega open in the initial stages. There are fascinating stories about the value of HBCUs and how they were seen in those times that I think are important for us to unpack in where we find ourselves in this contemporary moment in America.
Well, Mr. Mitchell, I don't feel very qualified to be involved in this conversation, but I'm going to try anyway. One point, when I first got to Morehouse, going back to the white forefathers, if you will, of HBCUs, that was the very first thing that kind of knocked me on my butt. I didn't know. I presumed that Morehouse was a Black man. But the story first came out about Spelman, I think the Rockefellers. I just presumed Morehouse, Spelman, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
This hype, I just knew there were Black founding fathers, and that wasn't the case. But as you were talking, I have a question for you. Are you inferring that the, what's it called? Agriculture and technical movement started with HBCUs? Like
Yes.
you have North Carolina A&T or agricultural and mechanical. From what you have just laid out, Booker T, I guess, was is there any book on this?
Yes, so there's a book that I would recommend. It's very, you have to order it. It's called the Business Strategy of Booker T. Washington. The Business Strategy of Booker T. Washington. I believe it's written by Michael Boston. It is a very under-circulated book, but he lays out in great detail. He lays out in very great detail what Washington was thinking. There's another book by a gentleman by the name of Donald Generals, I believe, Donald O. Generals. It's called Booker T. Washington, the Architect of Progressive Education. Now, let me just say this. Let me back up in history. And Donnie, I'm still learning this stuff myself. So if I misquote something, I'll come back and let you know I said it wrong. But just to be able to speak in generalities for a moment, land grant colleges were established by the Morrill Act, Morrill, I believe it is, in the mid 19th century, the mid 1800s. And that established land grant colleges. These were colleges that were designed for agricultural research, et cetera, to help America with this transition. And then they realized that because you had left out the majority of your labor force, which were the newly freed slaves, that they established land grant colleges such as Tuskegee, University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. You know, a lot of these land grant colleges, Alabama, North Carolina A&M, then North Carolina A&T, or North Carolina A&I, Hampton Institute. They established them for those purposes. But what's ironic is that if you look at most of those schools that were established as agricultural schools, these are the same schools that have now become the progenitors of Black engineers. They transitioned from agriculture to engineering, many of them remaining agricultural schools, and have added engineering. And that's part of the 15 schools that are HBCU engineering schools. So what I can say is that not only was Washington's curriculum the bedrock for how America came up with its comprehensive high school, Washington also, with his connection with the industrialists, was able to funnel money into many of these HBCU universities or colleges, including the land grant colleges, because the R&D money was coming from the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, et cetera. Washington also used some of that money to fund lawsuits in local areas where they were not even practicing legally the laws of segregation at the time. So there was no such thing as separate but equal, because they were not funding, according to the law, the schools necessary for Black children. So Washington privately funded lawsuits. He provided money to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to challenge some of these school districts to establish the schools necessary for Black children to be educated at the primary and secondary level. Now, why is that important, Donnie? Is because if you start HBCUs and you don't have a strong secondary, primary and secondary feeder pool, and many of the HBCUs serve that purpose, primary, secondary, and then on to post-secondary work. But as the need grew larger, Washington realized that we've got to make sure that that there are schools at the primary and secondary level as feeder pipelines for these newly established HBCUs. So I think it's in this greater context that we have to re-examine Washington and separate maybe some of the rhetoric versus the reality, to really see what this man was about. And then, as you are really following in similar footsteps with the work that you're doing and celebrating Black business, et cetera, Black entrepreneurship, independence, this is critically important. So Washington also, while he was seen by many as an accommodationist, Washington was then privately mobilizing networks and mobilizing communities. So not only did he mobilize the education community. He mobilized the entrepreneurial community. So for Washington, it was, let's education be a path to entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship be a path to Black empowerment, and Black empowerment be the engine that drives Black political power. Because separate from money, you cannot drive the political process. And that was his whole thinking. And then the other thing he was saying, he was trying to tell our community, don't massively leave your land. The Black migration, the great migration of Blacks from the South to the Midwest, we understand why that happened. But when you abandon property, you now kill the opportunity to pass down generational wealth. Land is the key to passing down generational wealth. And so you now abandon the ability to pass down the only real measure of wealth that you can touch. You abandon it in pursuit of the American dream in factory.
I don't know. So you know, I wrote this book, right? I Am Black Wall Street.
Okay.
And I look at how the first Blacks got to Oklahoma.
Right.
They came out of Florida.
Yes.
On the Trail of Tears as a result of the Second Seminole War.
Yes.
Andrew Jackson and the like of him, they wanted to rid Florida because up until 1831, Florida was owned by Spain.
Yes.
And if you were enslaved and you escaped into Florida,
yes,
you could find your freedom if you were willing to fight for the Spanish crown and convert to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
They had 3 wars. The Second Seminole War, we had 15 minutes. The Second Seminole War, Chief John Horse, the Blacks and the Black Seminoles, because Seminoles is all of the Indians who were chased into Florida. That was just a collective name. They fought to a truce, and the Caucasians promised Chief John Horse, if you put down your weapons, we can give you land in Oklahoma.
Right.
But before Oklahoma, Blacks were going from the Deep South because of the Klan. They were going to Kansas. All of that to say, they felt afraid for their lives.
Yes.
It's at least what I think I've learned. That the Klan, what they come about around 18, just after the Civil War, it was an onslaught against Blacks in the Deep South. Not everyone moved. You're right. Not everyone moved, but you can understand why people did move.
Let me make this point. I want to draw a line of demarcation and clarify a point that I'm making. What you're saying, you're talking about migrating to Kansas and Oklahoma. When those people migrated to Kansas and Oklahoma, they migrated and they acquired land. The backbone of the economy in Tulsa, Oklahoma was because of land ownership.
Yes.
I'm talking about abandoning land in pursuit of jobs in Chicago and other places that were industrial jobs where you became basically indentured servants. You did not have. Now we cannot second guess people escaping violence. We can't do that. But the wholesale abandonment, if you study, and I don't have enough research on this, Doni, and I yield to you on this. But as you have mapped out the Great Migration to places like Kansas and Florida and elsewhere, the reality is the notion that now you have to uproot and leave the roots that you established in pursuit of something better, I can understand. But if the something better is not there and you still uprooted and left land that you owned, you simply put yourself in a position to dispatch of monies that could be passed down generation to generation. And that's my
I was
larger
thinking they didn't
point
own
there.
I was just thinking they didn't own the land.
Well, we know this. Now maybe I can come back and I'll do some research on that. We know we can track that between, I believe it was early early 20th centuries up to 1960. And I need to check my facts on this. If I'm not mistaken, about 60 to astonishingly maybe 80% of Black land ownership was lost in this country.
Between the 20s and the 60s?
Between the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s to 1960. Check my facts on that.
That's my general understanding.
That a large swath of land ownership was lost. And Donnie, let me just say this, and I want to kind of come back, and I think I'm a little better on time now too. HBCUs. But I want to make this personal point. In my own family, being from Raleigh, North Carolina, I had a great uncle who owned 100+ acres of land in an area now that is dominated by super malls, suburbia, major buildup.
They call that Tobacco Road.
Tobacco Road. And when he passed, he owed taxes on the land, and the estate was not set up properly. And so my grandmother and her siblings and cousins were fighting over the estate. And ultimately they decided to settle. And they really settled for pennies on the dollar. And so what I have been saying oversimplifies the complications of Black land ownership. There's truly violence and terrorism that push people off of their property intentionally.
Yeah.
There was purposefully trickery to rob people of land. So I'm not blaming victims here. What I am suggesting, though, is that the mentality that began to ensue, that really became the underpinnings of this debate, at least in contemporary times, of Washington versus Du Bois, vocational education versus critical thinking. I think we have to understand that too is an oversimplification, and that really you had two people that were saying the same thing, but they were more so two sides of a coin. And I think where we find ourselves today is when you have a kid who is trying to determine, how is education my way out? HBCUs provide a pathway unlike any other institutions that make it possible for students to rise out of poverty with the support systems that need to be in place, with the affirmation that needs to be in place, and with the unlimited options of career paths that need to be in place. HBCUs, like any other institutions, have the unique ability of helping students regain a sense of who they are and empower the leadership that's within them so that they leave the campus ready to negotiate the world in front of them. And I happen to believe that as HBCUs take a look at how they can be even more of service to students and more service to the African-American community, the state, the nation, wherever they may be, going back to picking up on some of the lessons from Washington. I think we're going to get into a series of curriculum redesigns where students coming into HBCUs in that freshman and sophomore year will focus in on coming in with credentialing, whether that be data analytics or whether that be robotics or AI or whatever it may be. There'll be some sort of apprenticeship / credentialing that enables students to earn a wage, earn a living at a very competitive rate level, so that their second and third year of college, they are actually already on track for their career. And I think understanding why HBCUs can do this uniquely, other than some of the other four-year institutions that aren't really ready to make that pivot. Number one, our students need a quick path to be able to make money. Number two, it could be the pathway that lends them to start thinking their second and third year about how to now turn what they've learned into a business opportunity. It could drive a new class of entrepreneurs in our community. And then number three, I think what it does is it can help elevate them to begin to think globally as it relates to where they can take their skill set. So I think HBCUs are set up uniquely to provide solutions so that our community is not locked out of the next wave of economic development and globalization, but our community is participating on a global stage. Now, there's a lot of work that has to be done. There's a lot of effort that has to be done. But to me, being able to communicate clearly and cleanly and dispel stereotypes about HBCUs is why HBCU Week exists. So when people,
I gotta get something in, Travis.
okay,
Would you be willing to go to work on a farm? That's number one. You can ponder that for a second. And number two, when you mention Booker T and the feeders, now I just returned to Morgan for my master's. They have a Morgan Completes You program, particularly for older students. And what the professors there have told me is that older students are the largest demographic returning to HBCUs. There are many of us, I dare say, who have been traumatized by an HBCU experience, and the trauma being not finishing,
right,
for whatever reason, life.
Right.
Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a tremendous, I think there are three pools. I think it's older students that are a semester short, a year short, who want to complete their degree. And not only that, it's not just students of color or African-American students that didn't finish at HBCUs. There's students that didn't finish at PWIs. I think that presents a great opportunity for folks to be recruited to have that HBCU experience and love it. Whoever gets them across the finish line is where they're going to be loyal. And so I think that's brilliant by Morgan and other HBCUs that are reaching out. I'm on the board of Shaw University in Raleigh, where my parents went to school, and I walked as a little boy, and the campus as a little boy. And that's exactly what we're seeing in our data, that if we really want to grow, we have to reach the non-traditional student. At the undergraduate level, however, I think it's where we are able to present a clean and clear pipeline. There is a major research institution. I'll say it. George Washington University in DC has a program I've been watching for some time. They have created an online immersive experience for high school students. So there is an online, or at least there used to be an online high school where you have the prestige of being able to say that you're in George Washington's online high school. There are students from around the world that would go to this high school, and you can graduate from this high school with the same level of prestige, with the same level of credits and success that would happen in your local four-year school. And they create immersion experiences where they send the students around the world as a part of their immersion experience. Now, not all those students make it into George Washington, but they have cultivated a pipeline. And what I'm saying is I think the same thing could be done with HBCUs, where you create a pipeline. Students have an opportunity to identify with you through a credentialing process or through a virtual process. You send them on immersion trips from around the world, and they identify with you. So I think HBCUs have got to begin to continue what they're doing with the older populations, but we've got to make sure that we make it easy for people who want to join the HBCU experience or adopt a school, similar to how we have done in our communities. We were locked out of going to PWIs, but when it came to sports in North Carolina, people would choose for one of the PWIs because it was a North Carolina based school. So you'd go for UNC or pull for Duke or whatever. Same thing happened in Alabama between Alabama and Auburn. Who says you can't have people that are non-African Americans who say, I have adopted Morgan, I have adopted Coppin? Who says that you can't have people who are people of color who didn't graduate from HBCUs who say, I wear the orange and blue? I mean, it's a marketing technique. It's opening up and making sure that people can support your brand. So we want to increase brand visibility so that through HBCU, so that our schools can increase brand equity.
Okay. Now you have, I've been to North Carolina. I went to a family reunion.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of my dad's, his lady friend, God rest them both. Went down to Wilson, North Carolina. I'm from Baltimore, born and raised, other than a couple of years in Georgia. But I had a North Carolina experience in the Triangle, the Raleigh, Durham,
Chapel Hill, yeah.
And number one, I love North Carolina because they're not stingy with the food. If you ever been to New York, they're the stingiest people in the world with the food. You go there, they're stingy in New York City with the food. They come to Baltimore, you can't keep them out of your refrigerator. But I remember at this, and I wasn't blood family, but in this family reunion in Wilson, North Carolina, and by the way, we went past Roxborough to visit my uncle, and it was late night. And let me tell you something. I'm a city boy. I'm used to city lights, street lights. It was pitch black. I could not see my hand in front of me, and I was traumatized. And good luck to Harriet Tubman and all of that, but it was a unique experience for this city boy. North Carolina, you can eat all of the food you want. You can drink all of the liquor you want. But Sunday morning, you will be in church.
Absolutely.
All day. Well, however long church, but I remember they were not stingy with the food. And I just remember the hospitality. What is it about North Carolina? And I've since been further exposed to Aggie pride. What is it about North Carolina that, say, people in Maryland, DC, Pennsylvania, north of there, don't understand? And Georgia, by the way, was jive stingy too. They weren't all of that damn liberal. I never had a big breakfast, and they told me all this big breakfast stuff. I ain't get one big breakfast in Georgia, but North Carolina, they all right with me.
Well, I'm gonna attempt to answer that question and make sure that I don't alienate my family, many of whom are from Baltimore, Doni. So I have a long-standing big family here in Baltimore who embraced me when I came up from North Carolina on my dad's and my grandmother's side.
I'll say from New York. New York, the stingy ones, and ones in my own family. I'm here to tell you, they ain't got to worry about me waiting on some food.
But I think the spirit of generosity in North Carolina, I can only describe it through my rearing. And North Carolina is an interesting place. And if we look at North Carolina's history as it relates to the civil rights movement, North Carolina didn't get branded like Mississippi and Alabama, although there were hostile elements, and history can show that. North Carolina also became the epicenter of what I call statesmanship. You had the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at Shaw. But in a larger sense, my late uncle, was the chairman of the school board in North Carolina that was merged between the city and the county schools. And in that Raleigh-Durham area that you're talking about, one of the issues became how we were going to deal with school integration. And as we were able to come together, the forces that be in North Carolina, black and white, sat down for a series of conversations that would change the face of that area. And so they were able to come together around common ground. Now, Black community gave up a whole lot in terms of integration. And that's a whole nother story. Made a lot of sacrifices. High schools became middle schools. There's a whole lot of sacrifices, but sacrifices was also made on the other side of the equation. So North Carolina came up with an integration plan that built magnet schools in urban inner city areas that were densely populated by African Americans as a attraction, as a draw for people who happen to be in the suburbs to send their kids internally without disrupting the numbers of students from the local school. And what it ended up doing is became a model for the nation. And I happen just to think that in North Carolina, there have been people of greater goodwill that have stood up to figure out how to achieve common ground, especially around education, than the forces that would try to divide us that have happened in other states. I'm not ignorant to the fact that there aren't still issues serious issues in North Carolina of equity that have to be addressed and have to continue to be addressed. But I think the atmosphere in North Carolina around statesmanship is why you see North Carolina A&T as the largest HBCU in the country. Why
Man,
you
don't want to play the Aggies. They bring the grandma out, the fish, the dog,
and it's because of that.
babysitter.
It's because of that intergenerational staying close to your roots, taking pride in your schools, and then the state itself on many different corners. You know, there's an interesting thing that has happened in those red states, going back to where we started with the conversations. Even in the most conservative states, you'll find that there's bipartisan support at the state level for HBCUs. Now, some of that could be because you'd rather have people go to HBCUs than go to the PWIs. But the other part of that is there is a healthy respect in many quarters for the leaders of the institutions that have figured out a way to build these alliances around industry. And that still seems to be the place, even nationally. In the last presidential campaign, HBCUs, whether it was lip service or not, we know a lot of it was lip service. This was the first time that I recall in a major presidential election that both candidates had a plan to increase investment in HBCUs. I don't recall in past presidential campaigns where that became a part of the national platform. So I think HBCUs are at the right place at the right time. And going back to what's in the sauce in North Carolina, we say nothing could be finer than to be in Carolina. I'm going to have a saying for Maryland, Doni. I just don't have a rhyme for it yet. You got to help me figure out what the rhyme is. So on the speaking circuit, I got a nice tagline to make people in Maryland feel good.
I know your time is limited. Big ups to Black Wall Street in Durham, North Carolina, made famous by North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. Travis Mitchell, Maryland Public Television, Chief Content Officer. What's your other title?
You got it.
Okay.
Senior Vice President, but you got it.
Senior VP. Can't forget that part. And kudos to our mutual friend, Mr. Bob Ingram. So thank you for joining us this morning, and good morning, world.
Doni, don't forget to tell people to go to mpt.org/HBCU, mpt.org/HBCU. And you have on tomorrow, if I could just leave it at 4:00, if you missed it, if you missed on tomorrow at 4 p.m. Inside the CIAA, it aired last night. It's a half-hour documentary, and it repeats on Sunday at 4. So tomorrow night, let me back that up. Tomorrow night, 8 p.m. in prime time, Saturday, September 9th, inside the CIAA, and on Sunday at 4 p.m. Please, please, please make sure that people tune in. It's going to connect the CIAA tournament, which was fantastic here, to a history in Baltimore, and also to Morgan and Howard and the other HBCUs in the area who are also members of the CIAA at its founding.
And it's a Saturday.
Saturday, tomorrow at 8 p.m. in prime time, and then Sunday at 4 p.m. If you don't tune into anything else, make sure to check that out.
Good deal. Thank you for taking time with us this morning.
Hey, thank you, Doni. Thanks for the conversation. I'll get you some North Carolina barbecue, too, next time I'm down there.
My dad wouldn't let me leave the state without it. Now, you know, my Muslim friends didn't they? They didn't appreciate that, by the way. Salam alaikum, brothers.
All right, man. Appreciate you, man.
Good morning,
Bye-bye.
world. Yes,
Bye-bye.
sir.